All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us for Brainstorming the Future, using generative AI in your substance misuse prevention work with Brian Kloss. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services. The PTTC believes that words matter and uses affirming language in all our activities. I want to share a few housekeeping items with you. If you have technical issues, please individually message Rebecca Buller, that's me, or Chris Gabrielson in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and we will be happy to assist you. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar near the bottom of your screen and choose live transcript. AI note taker options. Please do not activate an AI note taker application. We do not allow this for several reasons, and we will ask you to disengage. If you do not disengage from that, we will remove you from the Zoom room. If you have questions for our speaker, please put those in the Q&A section, which is also at the bottom of your screen. This helps us not lose the question as the chat scrolls by. And then if you, at the very end, you will be redirected to a short survey link. And if you can complete that, we'd appreciate it so much. It takes about 3 minutes and it helps us improve our offerings and report to our funders. Finally, certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended this webinar in full, and it can take up to 2 weeks to receive those certificates. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing or information on upcoming events, please see our social media pages. And now I'd like to turn things over to Brian Kloss.
Okay, I'm going to share my slide here in just 1 second. Okay, hi, welcome. Great to see so many people here today. This is really exciting for me as a presenter and as somebody who talks a lot about AI these days. My life, AI has made my life very interesting. I sit at this weird intersection between instructional technology, computer science, and the humanities. I work at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. I have a number of roles there, all of which seem to have pointed me into the generative AI direction over the last couple of years. I am the assistant director for technology there. I'm a faculty member. I teach courses on health science communication, basically how to communicate the value of the really sometimes esoteric research that we do at Hopkins to non-expert audiences in clear and concise ways. And I also sort of have a theater background and this computer science background, and I work a lot in accessibility as well. And generative AI has sort of exploded and brought all these things together for me and for many of us in the last year or so. And I get asked a lot to talk about AI, certainly from people at Hopkins and outside. And so it's always fun for me. And I actually teach a course. I teach a course on using generative AI to improve a public health practice. And it's a super fun course. And a lot of what we're going to do today is a condensation of that 8-week course down into less than 90 minutes. So that's who I am and where I'm from. But what I'd love to hear from you, and you can type this in the text chat, don't use the Q&A for this one right here, are 2 things. One, there's a poll that we're about to launch. So Rebecca, if you don't mind launching that first poll so I could see what AI tools you are using, if you're using any AI tools at all. It'd be great for me to know that. And also in the text chat, if you wanted, what have you heard about generative AI? In particular, like what's up with generative AI? Is it something you got to worry about? Something that is super powerful? What have you heard about generative AI? So if you vote in the poll, that'd be super great. But also, if you want to type in the text chat, I can see really thinking about generative AI in your work. And also, one final thing. Yeah, so Davidson said it'll be the end of the world, right? There is this kind of like out there existential threat about generative AI. It's, worries about using it in an educational setting. Believe you me, Amy, every single day, people are like, people are cheating. Although interestingly, the conversation is changing now more from cheating to how this tool can be used in a practical way in the classroom, and particularly for scientific research, which is a really interesting kind of thing. Yeah, you have to be careful with it. Concerns with citing and with privacy, absolutely. Yeah, or that creativity will disappear. And as a creative person, sometimes myself, because I do have kind of a humanities background and worked in the theater for a while, that is a concern for me. Theft of work, right? Theft of artwork of other people. That's a serious issue, especially with tools like Stable Diffusion and others that sort of create images or videos or music. And speaking of music, by the way, I'm going to put a link in here. I don't know if any of you have heard AI generated music. It is not just like background airport mood music. It's pretty impressive what it can do. You don't have to go listen to that song right now, but it's pretty remarkable what you can do with generative AI. And thank you everyone for voting in the poll. I really appreciate it. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. It looks like most of you have used, I'll actually share the results so you can see the results here. Those who are familiar with it, ChatGPT seems to be #1, right? Microsoft Copilot and the Microsoft apps, less so, and as we go down. And Claude, which is excellent, because I'm going to recommend that folks use Claude today because it's so easy to use. Yeah, I have had the exact same experience, Tori, with students basically doing entire assignments with generative AI, and it's so painfully obvious to me. Sometimes they'll copy and paste in something that says, as a generative AI, comma, blah, 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 blah. It's like, how could you not see these things? So I'm going to move on. And I'm going to thank you for voting in the poll and thank you for the feedback in the text chat. Really appreciate that. And I want to spend a little bit talking first about how generative AI works, because I think this is really important that you understand how these tools work, because that gives you a really good idea of their possibilities and their limitations. And as you go along, if you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A. I'd greatly appreciate that. Okay, so how does generative AI work? Well, generative AI is based on pretty much something called a large language model, or a series of large language models. ChatGPT has one, Claude has one, Copilot, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, all the tools that are out there, they're all based on a large language model. What's that, right? If we're going to understand what it is, what is it? Well, I can explain it, or I could ask an AI, in this case, Claude, what a large language model is. And with a very basic prompt of what is a large language model, it tells me that it's a kind of artificial intelligence that's trained on a vast amount of text and learns statistical patterns and relationships within that text. And that's a really simple, concise explanation of how tools like ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or Claude work. So large language model is really about modeling patterns, modeling patterns. So a system that uses that large language model at its core can wind up giving reasonable responses to human inquiries. And in the long history, we've had a long history of AI tools in the last 40 years, tools like AlphaGo or Watson, for those of you who remember Watson from IBM, Siri, Alexa, Dragon Naturally Speaking, right? We've had these, which are really artificial intelligence, because these are artificial machine learning algorithms. But how do we get from this kind of specialized robot who can sometimes understand us, like Siri or Alexa, to these new tools that have so much power? Well, the thing that got us from AI that's been building for the last 40 years to where we are today is something called a transformer. And no, I'm not talking about the Hasbro toy. Transformers really were a massive leap forward in terms of what artificial intelligence algorithms could do. In a seminal 2017 paper called Attention is All You Need, 7 researchers at Google realized that they could make simple, powerful transformers that would take language in particular, and with these kind of self-contained transformers that didn't require lots of other compute and lots of other software systems, they could perform tasks that used to take minutes or hours to complete in a matter of seconds. So without getting too technical, a transformer sort of takes input and then outputs something very similar. It takes text in, puts text out, takes audio in, puts audio out. It's a black box that gives input, takes input and gives output. And in this case, the transformer on the screen is focusing on language translation. And it takes the phrase, je suis étudiant, and returns it in the English version, I am a student. And what the Google team realized is they could do this very, very rapidly in a much less complicated way using something new called a self-attention decoder, which is a very, very specific kind of transformer. Okay, so that's transformers, and I promise we're going to get back to them. Because of this work they did around transformers, and especially this self-attention decoder, a special kind of transformer named GPT-1 was created in 2018. So we see the name ChatGPT that's out there, right? So what is a GPT, right? Well, we learned sort of like what a large language model is, but what's a GPT? What does it mean? Because we talk about ChatGPT all the time. So GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Let me break that down a bit. It's generative in that the model itself is capable of generating continuations to your provided input. That means you give it some text and the model tries to guess which words come next and generate more text based on your input. And it's also pre-trained in that on a very, very, very large body of text. And that model is meant to be pre-trained once, just one time, and used for a lot of different things because it's super to train a model like GPT-4 that we currently use in a tool like ChatGPT. So that's why it's pre-trained to help save on costs. And there's a lot of pieces of data in this pre-trained model, this generative pre-trained transformer. So in the original model, GPT-1, which was released back in June of 2018, that was comprised of 117 million different combinations of text or parameters. GPT-4, which was released in March of last year, had 1.8 trillion pieces of information as part of its training data. That's just almost an unfathomable amount of data that's being processed. That's why it's super expensive and takes a really long time to generate these kind of large language models. But it still doesn't tell us how these large language models work. So without a master's in computer science, can we explain how they work? Well, yeah, because large language models are actually based on a really simple statistical model. So you can kind of think of a GPT or ChatGPT kind of like how meteorologists predict hurricane paths. You got millions of pieces of data that go into a system that predicts the path of the hurricane in real time. Now, the system is not going to be 100% accurate all the time. Sorry, that's just the way weather and hurricane prediction works. But it's going to make its best guess as to where the hurricane is headed in the next 24 hours. It uses data to generate probabilities for the path of the hurricane. And that's exactly what large language models do. The classic definition in computer science of a large language model, or sorry, of a language model, is a probability distribution over a sequence of tokens, or just more simply, words. So let's say we have a vocabulary of words represented by the V here, and we also have a sequence of tokens of individual words, word 1, word 2, word 3, word 4, so on. And a language model, represented here by P, assigns each different sequence of tokens, each different sequence of words, a probability, a number between 0 and 1 that tells us, as we use the model, how good or accurate a sequence of tokens actually is. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say we have a vocabulary containing 6 words: 8 ball cheese, the mouse green. And then the language model assigns a very specific probability to a specific sequence of these words in the vocabulary. So the language model would say that the sequence mouse, the cheese, 8 has a really low probability score, right? It's not something it sees in its training data. And the language model would say that the sequence the cheese ate the mouse also has a low probability score, although not as low as the other one. The model would assign a much higher probability to the sequence of words the mouse ate the cheese. So why would it do this? Why would this particular sequence have a much higher probability? They're just words strung together randomly, right? Well, the model itself has code, algorithms that evaluate both the syntactic probability of a sequence as well as world knowledge about how those words are used in the real world. And it gets both of these things from its training data from the millions, billions, or trillions of pieces of text that it processes when the model's being trained. And it also gets some foundational knowledge about how English, or really any language works, or English in this case, from decades of research and commercial deployment of dictation software, tools like Siri or Dragon Naturally Speaking. So the sequence the cheese ate, sorry, gets very low syntactic probability score because the algorithms inside the model say, this is not how these words go together in the real world in all my training data. The sequence the cheese ate the mouse also gets fairly low probability because the world knowledge the model has gained through its training also says, cheese doesn't eat mice, mice eat cheese. But the sequence the mouse ate the cheese gets a much higher probability because during its training, it's learned that the sequence has both good syntactic probability and world knowledge probability. So if someone's going to type the words the mouse ate into something like ChatGPT, the large language model would probably guess the cheese as the next couple of words because that particular sequence of words has a much higher probability than any other sequence of the same words. So we've seen how a large language model can assign a probability to a sequence of words, but how does it understand? How does it really understand what those words mean, right? Or what the context is? If I put the word it in a sentence, how does it know what the word it actually means? So this is where that transformer, that specific kind of transformer that I mentioned earlier, the self-attention decoder, comes in. So the self-attention decoder takes a word out of a sentence and looks at the entire sentence sequence of words in the sentence and then figures out what that word means. So in this example, the self-attention decoder could look at the word her and then be able to look at the whole sequence and say, aha, that refers to the word mother, or look at the word child and know that it refers to the word it. So a good self-attention decoder understands that words are related to other words by function, sometimes by referring to the same thing, or how they inform the meaning of different words. And what the Google researchers did back in 2017 was figure out that, again, you don't need a lot of other external resources to determine sentence structure, which is how research had been done, like all these super vast, complicated machinery, computer infrastructure to do this. All you needed was an attention decoder paying attention to itself to figure out how to understand the structure and meaning of sentences. And this made using these kinds of tools both simpler and orders of magnitude faster. So it's from this self-attention decoder that the system can say, this word relates to this word, the verb's related to the noun, and all the other functions of grammar that we understand intuitively as results. Now, these word relationships are then returned or translated, I should say, into a mathematical vector, those zeros and ones you see at the bottom of the slide. So in addition to those probability scores that we saw earlier, the self-attention transformer also takes these semantic embeddings, the fact that it referred to the child and then the mother refers to she in the sentence on the screen, and then turns this into a series of mathematical representations called vector-based embeddings. And it can be really difficult for us as humans to visualize what these embeddings look like and how they might work. But this particular visualization, but although not very friendly to people with red or blue color blindness, I apologize for that. Each bar represents a set of embeddings and how that word at the beginning of the bar might be correct or incorrect based on another word in the same sentence. So in this visualization, a dark blue bar means the probability of that word being correlated to another word in its vector embeddings is very low. Whereas a dark red bar indicates that the word is very highly correlated in its training to whatever the other word was. So, for example, the word see and the word orange probably don't have high correlation, so they'd be represented by a blue bar. But the word see and the word fish would have a very high correlation in the training data, and through that self-attention decoder, and it would have a red bar instead. The point of this visualization, the reason why I included it, is that it shows you how those numeric values really get translated into low or high correlation values in both syntax and world knowledge when it comes to training via the self-attention decoder. Now, ChatGPT, Claude, other really modern tools go one extra layer that until, honestly, ChatGPT came around, most language didn't really do. Large language models didn't really do. The research wasn't in that direction. It takes all these contextual embeddings, all this information about how words relate to one another in a sentence, into another decoder layer called a feed-forward neural network. Now, a neural network is like a large artificial brain that can usually tell what words come from after other words. And it's much more advanced, it's much faster and more accurate than previous decoders that did this kind of work. So you take this huge pre-trained model, you mix in this feed-forward neural network as people type in their questions, and you use the self-attention decoder to analyze the text, the individual words in the questions, in the prompts we're making, and that is what transforms that input into an output for you in ChatGPT, Claude, and other current generative AI tools. And I'm grossly simplifying this here because there's a lot of other steps in this. There's a lot of math in this. but it still all boils down to this simple probability. That's how large language models work. That's how ChatGPT works. That's how Claude, Microsoft Copilot work. And you got to remember, these are probabilities, not certainties. These are predictions, not facts. Okay, I realize that was a little bit technical. Again, that's the comp sci background, but hopefully you got an idea of how that works. And just to see whether or not you have an idea of how things work, really short 3-question pop quiz. Oh no, pop quiz. Don't worry, there's no penalty for this. So the first question I want you to answer, please, if you would. How does a large language model, or LLM, like ChatGPT, predict the next word in a sentence? So you have 4 options here. Pick the one that you think is the correct one, using a fixed set of rules, calculating the probability of word sequences, randomly selecting words, or following a preset narrative. That's the first one. I'll give everybody a second here. And it looks like the poll is open, so you can answer actually all 3 questions in the pop quiz. The second one is asking generative AI the same question multiple times will give you the exact same answer each time. True or false? And then finally, what's the fundamental characteristic of how generative AI operates? And there's 4 more answers there. So I'll give everybody just another couple minutes, a minute here to do this. I don't think the questions are too hard, hopefully not. But I'll definitely share with you the correct answers to this in just a minute. And these are actually sort of formative, non-graded review questions that I ask the students in my class at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. All right, we'll give everyone 10 more seconds to answer. See if we have enough time to do that. I realize that it's not a lot of time, but don't want to stay on this for too long. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll here. I apologize if you haven't gotten through all the questions, but I do want to go through the answers with everybody here. It should be pretty straightforward, but I make sure everyone has a chance to answer. Okay, and end it in 3, 2. Oh, and there. Thank you, Rebecca. Did it for me. All right. So how does a large language model like ChatGPT predict the next word in a sequence? Well, it does it by calculating the probability of word sequences, right? It's all probability. That's all that it is. Asking generative AI the same question multiple times will give you the exact same answer. False. It will not. You can give literally the same prompt 50 times, and you might get similar words coming back, but they're not going to come back in the same way, and the answer won't be exactly the same or even sometimes remotely the same every single time, because it's prediction, it's guessing, it's making a guess every single time. And what's the fundamental characteristic of how generative AI operates? They predict and refine outputs based on trained data. Again, with generative AI, it can only output something that in terms of data that it's been trained on or has been recently added to that request through a technique called retrieval augmented generation. Okay. So thank you everyone for voting. I really appreciate that. Thank you for doing the poll. I know pop quizzes can be a little stressful. Hopefully that was not. All right. So we've gotten through all the technical stuff. Let's get to something that's a lot more practical, and that's about writing good prompts. So when you type something into ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot and say like, help me plan an itinerary for a vacation to the Paris Olympics, whatever it is, that's the prompt. That's what you're telling it to do. That's what you're asking it to do. And good prompting is important. It makes an enormous difference in terms of your ability to get something useful out of a tool like ChatGPT or Claude. Effective prompt writing is a skill, and like most skills, you can become better at it with practice. So I'm going to go over the basics of writing an effective prompt, and then we're all going to put this together in practice in just a few minutes. And like with many other skills, you put garbage effort in, you're going to get garbage results out, right? Or to be more nice, the more care you put in your prompts, the better results you're going to get. And again, that's about saving you time, right? If you want to use these tools, and many people do, and some businesses need to use them, some organizations absolutely are 100% behind this, saving time is always important. None of us ever have enough time. So if we can write good prompts, learn to write good prompts, we can get the answers and results we want faster rather than having to do long back and forth with ChatGPT or Claude or any of these tools. So let me give you a brief demonstration of this. Here's an example of a minimal effort prompt that gives me okay to kind of minimal effort results. And don't worry, you're going to get a copy of these slides so that you can get all the prompts and all that stuff after the webinar. So the prompt here is list 10 ideas for a paper about substance misuse prevention. And it gives me 10 generic, though possibly useful responses. But if I put more effort into crafting the prompt about the same topic, I actually get much better results. Now the prompt is you're an expert in substance abuse in the Great Lakes area. You've spoken at international conferences, testified in front of Congress, you speak in a formal academic style. And all of a sudden, the results look like something for titles for an academic paper, right? Using domain-specific terminology, and each title has a specificity of focus that the previous list lacked. So when you type a prompt into ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or any of these tools, the context you give it is critical because the tools always perform that semantic analysis on the provided prompt. They're not looking for exact text matches, which is how Google operates, right? Google looks for exact phrases. Your large language model, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, they're trying to understand entire sentences and the semantic structure of that sentence, right? They use that self-attention decoder to generate your prompt into generated output. So the quality of that prompt is really important. The prompt tells the large language model what it needs to do, and the details and specifics of that prompt have a measurable impact on the quality of the output that the LLM generates. Now, some tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot can actually remember an entire conversation and the entire context that you've had when you ask more questions in response to earlier questions and response. Even then, detail and context is important to these large language models to get useful and hopefully factually accurate answers. So there's a couple strategies you can use to create better prompts that give large language models the information. So the first one is be specific. So if we go to an auto mechanic and say like, my car is dead, fix it, that's not going to be very helpful to the mechanic, right? Without specific details, the mechanic can only guess what the problem might be. But if we go to the mechanic and say, okay, so I was driving and my car started vibrating and then the engine started sputtering and then the engine stopped and I was able to pull over and get the car started again. But then when I got it started again, it sputtered some and stalled out after a couple of seconds. That gives the mechanic tons of information to go on, right? And they'll probably start looking at the fuel injector because that's what their internal model in their brain and their experience tells them is the most likely culprit. So being specific is important. So let's say you work at a nonprofit and you're looking for ways to drive up donations to your nonprofit because what nonprofit does not need more donations, right? So our basic prompt is, I work at a nonprofit. How can I get more donors? You're going to get a response. It's kind of generic, but it may not specifically address the real problems that your nonprofit's having in terms of fundraising. But if I create a prompt that's much more specific about the exact problems I'm having, focusing on a nonprofit in Ann Arbor, Michigan, worried about a donor death spiral, we provide more context and give more specific instructions. In this case, provide me 3 strategies that we can use to avoid this donor death spiral and contrast the strengths and weaknesses of each of those strategies. And we get something that's actually helpful. This is a much more effective response from the LLM than some sort of broad general statement. And again, you'll get a copy of these slides so you can look at these in more detail. Again, context is key. And generative AI can be a great teaching assistant or tutor. In one of my classes that I teach at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, we actually have students learn about a new topic using generative AI as a tutor. It's great for research, if you're doing research for scientific writing, academic purposes, whatever. But if I ask a really broad question when I want to learn about something, I'm going to get a broad response that's not necessarily useful to my specific aims and objectives. But again, if I provide more context, I'm going to go back to school and I need to work on my chemistry knowledge and then ask for a structured and comprehensive approach to learning that topic, the LLM, in this case, Copilot, gives me a concrete outline that can follow for the next 3 months. A lot more helpful. All right, next up, start with an action word: create, write, make, generate. These action words direct the LLM to generate useful, actionable output in most cases. Because if you don't include these kind of action words, the LLM will give you information that might be relevant, but not specifically useful to solve a problem or take an action. So here's a brief example of this. I asked Microsoft Copilot, can you tell me how to become a substance misuse prevention program manager? And it gives me all sorts of general information, right? The kind of skills, information I might need to know, workplace stuff, education. It's a lot, but it doesn't really help me start down that path. Where do I begin? But if I instead say, create a career plan to become a substance misuse program manager in 2024, I'm providing more details. And I'm also putting an action verb up front. And I get a step-by-step outline to this process. Again, it's a little bit broad, right? It goes by 2 months at a time. I could probably drill down, but this is much more actionable than what I got with my first prompt without one of those verbs at the beginning of the prompt. So that's a second strategy. The third one is role play, or more specifically, tell it who it is and therefore what it can do. So remember that first example I showed you about ideas for an academic paper about substance misuse? Well, I said, just give me ideas. And it gave me some okay ideas. But then I said, you're an expert in the topic. And it gave me a richer set of responses that were much more refined to what I wanted to do in the first place. So don't be afraid to tell the large language model who its audience is, like who it is, right? Whether it's an audience of high school students or researchers at a conference or on microbiology or policymakers in Washington, D.C. Tell it who its audience is, tell it who it is as well, and you'll get much better responses. So here's an example. I said, pretend you're a master's student in public health and read this study. Give me a paragraph summarizing the methods section, come to a definite conclusion about the validity of the methods and why they are good or bad. And I know you don't have the paper at your disposal here, but the results are actually pretty useful. And we're going to do a similar exercise in just a few minutes. But the results are useful because it has a context that says, this is who you are. And because of the magic of LLMs, which you don't really entirely sure how they quite work in some of these ways, it infers a set of skills and it infers a kind of writing style from this. And then it does what you want and gives you much more useful results. So to recap, provide useful context, be specific, start with an action word, and role play. Including all 4 elements will make your prompts better and the output from the generative AI much more useful to you. Okay, so now we're going to do a fun activity. And Rebecca, if you don't mind putting the links into the chat there for everybody, these were sent to everyone beforehand. Because what we're going to do, what I'm going to ask you to do, is take one of the 3 journal articles that were selected by the team earlier for you. And you can look youth as leaders and partners in substance abuse prevention. One is about a national strategy for preventing substance abuse and opioid use disorders. And one is about the role of law enforcement in drug prevention within educational settings. So all relevant articles. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to ask you on your own in your web browser to upload this article to either Microsoft Copilot or Claude.ai. Now, I would suggest personally Claude because it's the easiest to get into. Sometimes people have challenges getting into Microsoft Copilot because if you use like Microsoft 365 in your work, it can sometimes, they have it set up so it locks things down so you can't actually access Copilot yet. Claude should be open to anybody in the United States. It's at, and thank you, Rebecca, for putting the link in there, the Claude login. If you log into Claude, it'll ask for your email address. It will then send you a link. You click on an email that will get you into Claude. You don't have to use Claude if you don't want to. You can use Copilot. You can use ChatGPT. ChatGPT, you have to have a paid account to attach a file to a question, to a prompt. So that's why I don't necessarily recommend ChatGPT, although for those of you who are using it, if you have a paid account, by all means, please go ahead and use it. So please download one of these PDFs and then go into Claude, go into Copilot, and think about how you write your prompt. Remember, I just talked about 4 strategies that you could use to, these 4 strategies: provide useful context, be specific, start with an action word, and role play. Add all these in your prompt. Give everybody a couple minutes to do this. And if you've already done it, you've already sort of seen what the results are, write about it. I want to know, how did it go in the text chat, right? What were the accuracy and usefulness of the results? You can put that in the webinar chat. If it's easier for you, you can raise your hand. We have the webinar set up so you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. A lot of times that's much, much easier than typing long pieces of text into the text chat there. So again, go to Claude.ai or go to Microsoft Copilot or ChatGPT if you know how to use those tools and already have access, and try doing ask it to summarize that paper for you, right? That's the goal, is to summarize the paper using the prompt techniques that I just talked about, which were, again, provide useful context, be specific, start with an action word, and role play. Give everybody just a couple of minutes to do this. And then whenever you're ready, once you've done this, you can put your sort of your feedback. How did it go? Was it useful? Was it accurate? Is this something you might do yourself in your daily work? You can type that in the text chat again, or click the raise hand button in the reactions tool in Zoom if you want to talk, which is perfectly fine with me as well. So we'll give everyone just a couple of minutes to do this, and hopefully we'll start seeing feedback come in just one moment. And if you are having problems, by the way, type in the chat. I'm happy to answer, see those problems. But yeah, if you have questions about anything I've covered so far, as Chris just said, you can put them in the Q&A as well. I realize most of you are probably like, stop talking, I'm trying to do this in Claude right now. Yeah, so it clarified substance misuse from the article. So Copilot found the right article, but Claude summarized the wrong one. Interesting. So with Claude, the reason why Claude summarized the wrong one is it probably confabulated the whole thing. And because Claude is not hooked up to the internet at all. Although it gets most of its training data from the internet, it's not currently connected to the internet. So if you say, go find this article, it's not actually going to be able to do that because it's not currently hooked up to the internet. The paid version of ChatGPT is, and you can say, go find this article and summarize it. Microsoft Copilot is connected to the internet. So you can say, go find this article and summarize it, but Claude can't do it. Sala, you can choose whichever of the 3 articles that you want, right? Any of the 3, you can do that. So yeah, so Sydney, it's not surprising that Claude summarized the wrong article. And I'll talk about confabulations and why these large language models make this stuff up in just a few minutes. And yeah, Beth, so the reason why I'm having you all do this exercise, oh, I'm sorry, Courtney. So on Copilot, you have to be signed in to Copilot. And when you're signed in, right in the chat box, the prompt box itself, there'll be a little paperclip icon, like you would see in a tool like Outlook or many other services. You click on the paperclip icon, that will allow you to upload the PDF file there. Let's see. Claire says, I used Claude for engaging the youth and asked it, you are a prevention coordinator, excellent, for the youth, and you are looking for ways to engage with the youth that you work with. Summarize this article and give key details and strategies. That's awesome, exactly. You being specific, you're giving it context, you're role-playing all the things that you, and give it that action verb. That's great. Sarah says, work great, asked to help me summarize and present to a substance use prevention community coalition of general community members. Her readability is at 8th grade level. I'll tell you, generative AIs are wonderful at taking existing content and rewriting for different audiences and different knowledge levels. It's quite remarkable if you take the same paragraph, something that you wrote, and then say, write this as for PhD students in a microbiology program at Johns Hopkins University, or write this for an audience of in the Baltimore community where the readability level is at the 8th grade. Most people have an 8th grade reading level. It's remarkably good at doing this. So yeah, a lot of which is good. Yeah, and right. So Becca had it do the summary in 2 different windows, and it gave kind of 2 different answers. And that's exactly it, right? These are probability machines, so they don't give out deterministic answers. The answers might be similar, but they're not going to be the same, and they won't always give you exactly the same content in each response because they are probability machines. So yeah, what's great about LLMs right now, particularly I think for those of us who work in public health across any number of disciplines, including obviously substance abuse prevention or substance misuse prevention, excuse me, is that there's a lot of research. There's a lot of research out there, and keeping up with the research is really hard. Because of what I do, I have to keep up with the AI research and public health research and educational technology, instructional design research. I can't read all those papers. Claude, ChatGPT has been a lifesaver for me in terms of I hear about an interesting paper or someone says, hey, did you read this paper? And I'm like, I'm just going to put it in Claude or ChatGPT or Copilot, have it summarized for me. And I'm like, oh, that seems interesting. And then if I really want to delve down, I can go back and read the paper myself. It's really helped me optimize my time for around the literature, around the research, anytime like that. All right, so this is great. I really appreciate all of the feedback you're giving in here. It sounds like it's really useful for things. But yeah, so Drew says, interestingly, I instructed Claude to not only summarize, but localize the data to our area, and it provided excellent summary, but only provided very generic local implications of the study. Yeah, so that's one of the challenges, is I think that when you want something that's really specific to a specific population, whether it's a geographic population, age strata, behavioral population, whatever it is, you do need to provide a lot more detail about exactly where, the exact population. Sometimes providing additional data sets will help it better understand your specific goals. So we're just doing what they call one-shot prompting, where it's like we just put one prompt in, but you can continue on the conversation and get better responses and more detailed responses by adding more later on itself. Oh, so Rachel got a really interesting one. I asked Claude to summarize youth engagement article and to argue against youth engagement prevention. It replied that it did not feel comfortable, and the article provides good evidence and rationale for youth engagement. So that is one of the really fascinating things about LLMs and generative AI right now. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of anthropomorphization of these tools. But the people who make Claude and the people who make ChatGPT and all the tools, they kind of want to, especially Claude, they're trying to give it a personality. And the personality often manifests itself in terms of guardrails of things like, I am sorry, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that, or I feel uncomfortable doing that. Like if you say, tell me how to make a bomb, it'll be like, ooh, I can't do that. These guardrails, these things that hopefully prevent it from passing on potentially harmful information, often result in a kind of, sort of personality test for these large language models. So yeah, sometimes you ask it to do something that seems really obvious or useful, and it's like, nope, can't do it. Won't do it at all. I have in one of the classes I teach, I have students do a public health campaign, a misinformation / actual real public health campaign, although a couple people have to do misinformation. And part of it is generating images. And if you use the word abortion, it will not generate a related image. If you use the word a breast, it will not make a generated image, generate an image, because of the word breast. And breast cancer awareness and breast cancer research, really important. But the word breast appears in there, so it won't do it. So these kind of guardrails are really interesting, and they have a lot to do with the harms that can absolutely come out of these tools. All right, I want to move on here really quickly. 2 questions that came into the text chat. If different people ask Claude the same thing, is it likely you're going to get the same summary? Or does it have a natural variance in response, never giving the exact same thing twice? So yes to both things. So you'll get a similar summary, but not the same thing. Again, because these are probability engines, and because the behind-the-scenes programming of these large language models allow you as the person who makes the app, as the person who makes Claude or ChatGPT, to adjust something called the temperature. They call it the temperature. I don't know why, but that allows you to say each response to the same prompt should be wildly variable, or each response to the response should be really similar. Most of the tools like ChatGPT, Claude have a temperature that's fairly low, because they want to replicate something like a Google-like experience, but you're never going to get the exact same answer twice. Ask AI to research on its own about a community to obtain the data on its own, or do we need to do the legwork and copy and paste the data in the chat? Excellent, excellent question. So in terms of going out and finding stuff on the internet and data in particular, you would need to use Microsoft Copilot, because Copilot is formerly Microsoft Bing, their search engine that they've overhauled. That will go and search for research and find references on the internet. ChatGPT, the paid version, has a tool in it called Code Interpreter, and that tool will actually go out and pull data off the internet. You have to verify that it used the appropriate methods for analyzing that data. It will sometimes completely make stuff up. So yes, you can use those tools to go grab data off the internet and do data analysis instead of just providing a data file yourself. But again, with any data analysis, you have to make sure it's doing it correctly, because LLMs are great at words. They're not so great at math, at least not yet. Hopefully that answers your question there. All right, so moving on. So hopefully that was a useful exercise to you. Hopefully it really will be for you. All right. Well, that's a good question, Mariette. Is it worth to do because you have to verify on your own? And I would say, yeah, it saves time. I think in things like summarization, ideation, brainstorming, LLMs are amazing. With data analysis, you need to have a foundational set of skills and knowledge. If you don't have that foundational set of skills and knowledge, you're not going to know whether or not something was done correctly. And when we talk about cheating in an educational environment, this is the thing I come back to time and again, is that students will not be able to effectively or reasonably cheat without that baseline knowledge, because they will have zero idea if what the LLM is generating is even remotely accurate or remotely true. They've got to have the knowledge to be able to say, ooh, that's wrong, before I turn it in, because otherwise they're going to turn it in with lies, made up stuff that will really get them in trouble. All right. So I want to move on to talk a little bit about confabulation, since I talked about this a little bit earlier a couple times in the last few minutes. So we learned so far that generative AI is just a giant prediction machine, right? The algorithms predict certain words, going to follow other words, and best match your original prompt. And they're very good at this. They're really good at this, but they're still just predicting. And that's important to understand, that generative AI has no real sense of truth. It cannot tell you the truth because it does not know in any meaningful, non-anthropomorphized way what the truth is. And if you ask ChatGPT to create a table of GDP versus life expectancy for every country in the EU from 1980 to 2020, it'll do it, right? This gets back to that question of finding data, can go out and find it. But take a close look at that image, that response there, right? Note the caveat just before the table of the results. Quote, the values provided here are examples and may not reflect the exact data for each year, end quote. So in other words, those values are probably made up. They may not be accurate. And so you got to really check the accuracy of anything that comes out of an LLM. Now, Microsoft Copilot, is better because it's hooked up to its search. Google Gemini is hooked up to its search. So it'll give you references so you can verify and validate, but you still have to check. And now the technology press that covers, generative AI's propensity to make up facts typically calls these actions hallucinations. It's probably what you heard a lot in the press, right? Hallucinations. But I think a more appropriate term here is confabulation. There's two reasons for this. First, the technical term confabulation refers to generation of plausible sounding but potentially inaccurate or fabricated information when there's a gap in someone's memory. This is what folks with dementia do. They confabulate a lot. And this is a common behavior of large language models when they produce responses that are based on limited or incomplete knowledge. Remember, all these tools have, for the most part, a baseline cutoff knowledge, like we trained up until this date. Yes, they can tap into the internet, but that's foundational information is still limited in terms of its cutoff date. The second reason is that a hallucination is, quote, a sensory experience of something that does not exist outside the mind. Well, ChatGPT doesn't have sensory experiences. ChatGPT doesn't have a mind as we would define that term in relationship to human consciousness. So by using the word hallucination, we continue to perhaps dangerously anthropomorphize ChatGPT and other generative AI tools. Confabulations, for me, is a more technically correct term, given how large language models work. So that's the term I really prefer to use. So how do you know when ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot is confabulating something? Well, you don't, right? Some things might be obvious to you, such as a factually incorrect definition of a scientific term, but these kinds of confabulations are really rare now because of the really large, continually growing data sets behind them and the corrections that these companies like Microsoft and Anthropic have made to their large language models to make sure they don't do this again. You can try to force confabulations, but you can't really guarantee you're going to get one. But why would a system as powerful as ChatGPT or Copilot make stuff up? And I think it can help to think of the AI as trying to optimize many, many different functions when it answers one of your prompts. And one of the most important prompts that it has is to make you happy by providing an answer you'll like, because that keeps you coming back. That keeps you going more. It makes more money for Microsoft. It makes more money for Anthropic. It makes more money for OpenAI. And in that function of making you happy is often more important than another goal that it has, which is to be accurate. So if you're really insistent enough on asking it for an answer for something it doesn't know about, it's going to make up something because it making you happy beats being accurate. But confabulations are not all bad. Confabulations can be a really interesting area for exploration and brainstorming. And really one of the easiest and most interesting ways to do this is to ask the large language model to apply common knowledge to fictional settings. This is great for brainstorming. So in this example, I asked ChatGPT to design a public health intervention to reduce the use of pipeweed and beer by the residents of Hoppiton in J.R.R. Tolkien's book, The Hobbit. Well, it's doubtful that public health and pipeweed cessation was of remote interest to J.R.R. Tolkien when he wrote The Hobbit. So ChatGPT has to confabulate in order to generate an answer. But the ideas that ChatGPT generated here are actually contextually appropriate and a pretty good starting point. It's totally made up, but the point is that demonstrates that sometimes confabulations can still be useful. And here's another confabulation which might have real-world applicability. We're asking ChatGPT to design interventions for a totally fictional addiction issue. In this case, the pervasive and corrosive use of spice for space travel. So while the context might be completely fictional, there are real-world applications in the proposed interventions and something to be learned there. And these examples are contrived. I get it. And the fact is you still have to fact check the work of any text-based generative AI that you used. You don't know if it's going to confabulate one small part or the entirety of a response. And that's particularly the case when you ask a text-based generative AI to cite sources or work on a statistical data set, because as I mentioned, generative AI is great at text, less great at math. All right, so with that said, let's get to some brainstorming. We're gonna go back to Claude or Copilot, whichever tool you're currently using. So again, for this exercise, we're gonna do some brainstorming around your daily work here. So we're gonna use Microsoft Copilot, you're gonna use Claude, whatever tool you're already using, just go ahead, keep using it. You're gonna wanna clear out the conversation, start a new conversation. Usually that's on the left side of the box where you type in your prompt. There's a button that's like start new, a brush or a broom to clear stuff out. Start with a new conversation. That's going to be the best way to go. You don't want it to follow up on your last conversation about summarizing the article, although you could, and that will influence what comes out. But what I like you to do is brainstorm. What are brainstorms? Just ask it to come up with something that would be useful in your daily work. And thank you, Rebecca, for putting the suggested ideas there. Like, what are 3 evidence-based interventions to prevent binge drinking in college fraternities? Or what's an icebreaker for a meeting that for both you and adults? Or how can I effectively market my substance misuse prevention program? Now, remember, keep in mind all the stuff we talked about earlier about role play, context is critical, use an action verb, try to incorporate that as well, but think about ask the tool to help you brainstorm ideas for your work, for the things you would actually do in daily practice. You don't have to use one of these exact prompts, but try to have it come up with something that you would use in your daily practice, something that you would actually need to do and need help brainstorming or coming up with ideas for. So again, use Copilot, use Claude, whatever tool you had before, start a new conversation. But go ahead, I'm going to take another sip of water. And as soon as you start getting responses, let us know what you did. Okay, so Sydney asked a really good question. What about using AI to generate graphics? I've had troubles getting sensible outputs. Yes, 1000% yes. Contrary to what Microsoft may want to be selling you with their AI Copilot for Microsoft 365, you really can't create useful, valid Excel output, Excel graphs, tables, and charts yet in using large language models that are built into like Microsoft Copilot. They're getting better. The latest versions of DALL-E, which is a image generation tool that's built into ChatGPT, as well as Midjourney, which is a separate, very, very powerful image generation tool. They can't do text. They can't do text. They're getting better, but the text still looks kind of weird. It's not quite right. And when it comes to graphs, tables, charts, any kind of figure, well, tables they can do. I take that back. Tables you can do. You can tell a large language model, output this as a table, and it will do it for you, and it will format it really nicely. But if you say, make a line chart, a bar chart, a histogram, it will do a terrible job with that. They are still very bad at translating textual information into pure data visualization form. They're just not good at that. The generative AI tools are great if you're like, I need an image of a 24-year-old who has been addicted to, has been misusing heroin, and they are walking out of a treatment program center. It'll make that image for you, and it'll actually be probably really, look good and look right and look contextually appropriate. It can do people, it can do fantastical situations, can't do words, can't do charts, but that's coming. That's really coming there. So Sarah's experience was actually throughout real evidence-based programs you're currently using. Excellent. So one of the great things about using LLMs, one of the good and bad things. Bad, that these large language models basically stole everyone's information on the internet to help do this training before ChatGPT or GPT-3.5 came out. So they have the broad knowledge of the internet. So I'm sure you've heard stories or seen reports. It's like, ChatGPT scores, in the top 2% on the SAT or the law school exams or medical exams. Well, yeah, when you have all the knowledge of the internet at your fingertips and you're able to retrieve it in a matter of milliseconds, of course you're going to score well on these multiple choice tests, right? That's I think that's one of the really interesting things about it, because all that data is there. And because all that data is there, you will, and I've certainly encountered this as well, you're doing brainstorming for research, you're doing brainstorming for interventions, whatever it is, and stuff will come up and be like, oh yeah, we've used that technique, or I remember that study, because it's pulled all that information from publicly available data sets as examples up until its training cutoff date, which for GPT-4, which is the underlying model for ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot, that cutoff date is September of 2023. Microsoft Copilot then, again, goes out and searches the web and uses a technique called retrieval augmented generation to help integrate that into the response that comes out of the core of the LLM, which had its training cutoff date of September 2023. Okay, let's see. So Karthar says, what are some ways to increase engagement from participants? Got some good results. Good. Yeah. So interestingly, Peter said, can the chatbot be used for writing session notes for a counselor? And Claude said, no, you cannot use a publicly available chatbot due to HIPAA. And Copilot gave you 3 options of 3 HIPAA compliant chatbots. Again, because Copilot will go out there and search the web and bring that stuff in, and it finds those websites, those ads, whatever it is. And that is actually a caveat about Copilot. Copilot is starting, a couple months ago, Microsoft announced that Copilot, the public version of it, the website version, will start integrating ads into its responses. Surprise, surprise, there. So Sheila said, asked to create a social media post, came back to something very specific or similar to last year. Yeah. So Mariad asks about, can we talk about the role of bias in artificial intelligence and the public health implication and how we can mitigate that? I'm going to talk about bias. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, Mariad. I got like 10, 12 minutes on it. I think it's a really good segment. Hopefully that'll answer your questions. And we could talk a little bit about mitigation later on. Lesson plan for an outdoor event in June. Great. Excellent. Brainstorm, address stigma around SMP. Cool. I'm glad you guys are getting effective use out of this. So yeah, I think these tools can be really, really helpful in your everyday work. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. So it's pronounced like parade with an M. Oh. Marade, right? Would be it? Marade, is that it? Yeah, okay, cool. Excellent, Marie. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm very sensitive about mispronouncing names. I work with lots of students from all over the world. Population at Public Health, Bloomberg School of Public Health is super international, and people mispronounce my name all the time. So I totally get where you're coming from. All right. So hopefully that was a valuable exercise for you. I think it just, there's a lot of opportunity for ideation that can be directly applicable, and brainstorming can be directly applicable to our work. And hopefully you got some sense of that here today. All right, so now I'm going to get to what Mairead was just asking about, because I'd like to finish up the last thing I'm really going to talk about today for the next 10 minutes or so. I want to talk about one of the biggest challenges that we as public health professionals face in our use of generative AI tools. And that is, there are many very real opportunities for harm in the use of generative AI. When I teach about this topic in my classes at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, I deliver just one 90-minute lecture that still only scratches the surface of this problem. And I'm going to try and give you the highlights in the next 10 minutes. And just as a brief warning, we're going to talk about some harms from multiple perspectives. So some of the content might be uncomfortable or maybe even a little upsetting. So these tools, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Midjourney, Sonos, all the generative AI tools are tools of untruth and seduction. Remember, the tools like ChatGPT and Claude are prediction machines. They generate probabilities, not certainties. And because they create really persuasive results, as many of you have encountered, we assume that they're telling the truth, especially when we first start using the tools. And this fits perfectly in the definition of bullshit by Harry Frankfurt. And that is that bullshit speech is intended to persuade the truth and attempts to hide it. But the BSer doesn't care if what they say is true or false, only cares whether the listener is persuaded or not. And this is important because contrary to the preachers of ChatGPT or Claude or Microsoft Copilot's self-awareness, these tools cannot, and for the foreseeable future, will not be able to tell if they actually know something or not. No matter how hard it tries, generative AI cannot generate anything with concept of truth. And generative AI's lack of truth is highly exploitable. A February 2023 study from Stanford University's Polarization and Social Change Lab showed that AI writing can sway human opinion on social issues like assault weapon bans, carbon tax, paid parental leave. And for this study, they used GPT-3, which is an earlier version of what we have in ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot now, to generate the text. And in this study, the participants were asked to describe the qualities of the text that they had read, and AI text ranked consistently as more factual, more logical, less angry, and less reliant upon storytelling as a persuasive technique compared to human written text in that same study. And the fact that we assign human qualities and characteristics to ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot or Claude uses a human name for the service itself. How are we not supposed to treat generative AI in a kind of human way? And in fact, when we give these tools a human name. And this is what robot researchers Brenda Leong and Evan Selinger call dishonest anthropomorphism. When technology is designed in misleading ways that exploit humans' innate tendency to anthropomorphize and respond socially. So by attempting to give AI tools like Copilot or Claude personalities, which they do, companies like Microsoft, Anthropic are attempting to strongly anthropomorphize these tools. But if we treat Copilot or Claude as a human for all of its positive qualities, we also have to treat it as a human for all of our negative qualities, including our fallibility, our ability to make things up, our ability to misunderstand. And the language that's used to describe tools like ChatGPT or Claude tends to anthropomorphize their abilities. We use words like think, understand, reason when it describes these tools, when they can actually do none of these things. They are superb predictors of probability, but they cannot and do not think, reason, or understand as humans do. Certainly not yet. So let's move on now to what is probably the most obvious harm enabled by generative AI, the ability to create misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation is false or inaccurate information, just getting the facts wrong. Disinformation is false information which is deliberately intended to mislead, intentionally misstating the facts. And I think it's probably pretty obvious where both misinformation and disinformation come into play with generative AI. Generative AI is a creator of misinformation. It makes stuff up, right? That stuff may sure sound persuasive, but it's not always true. And as consumers of generative AI, or really any AI in general, or any tool or information found on the internet, we have to fact check the content that's generated. If ChatGPT cites a source, you better make sure that source is real. If Claude refers to a study, you better make sure that study actually exists and that the AI's understanding of the content of that study is accurate. You still have to assess the work that it does. Disinformation is where generative AI, especially multimedia-based generative AI, could become really, really bad for us. Now, this image of Pope Francis wearing a Balenciaga coat caused a lot of controversy when it first appeared online on social media last year. When this image went viral, tens of thousands of people commended the Pope on his killer fashion sense, while an equal number condemned this as yet another example of the corrupt nature of the Catholic Church. Now, most people who saw this image thought that it was real until they learned that it wasn't. It wasn't intended as like harmful disinformation, but it was a distortion of the truth. The coat does not exist. Pope Francis never wore a coat like this, but it sure looks like he did. And when we, as well, really a species now, become conditioned to rapidly process large swaths of visual information as truth and truthful experience on platforms like Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, we learn to take imagery at face value. And a photorealistic imager generator that can pretty much visualize anything you want it to could be very dangerous indeed. And deepfake videos, where a video is created of an individual saying or doing something they never did in reality, are very much a harbinger of this new, how do we know if it's really real future? All right. Now we're going to take a look at bias and how it is quite persuasive. I'm sorry, quite pervasive, not persuasive, pervasive in the generative AI tools that we use today. So because of our tendency to anthropomorphize technology and technology's companies' encouragement for us to do so, because it sells more product, we assume that these generative AI tools are good at a broad range of tasks. They're certainly impressive in a wide range of tasks, but not everything. So there's been a lot of discussion about using AI in healthcare. You've probably seen a lot of articles about this. There's a lot of journal research, stuff like it can be as good as a trained expert in specific fields. I just read one this morning about ophthalmologists and how AI can be just as good, if not better, than trained ophthalmologists. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has already approved the use of very specific algorithms in clinical settings for screening images for cell clusters or patterns that indicate the presence of lung or breast cancer. It's effective. Its efficacy has been proved over like the last 10 years. They're really good, if not better than some radiologists, at noticing really small clusters that are going to turn into some kind of cancer, lung or breast cancer. But in a June 2023 article, the Wall Street Journal talked about the case of Melissa Beebe. She was an oncology or is an oncology nurse with over 15 years of experience at the University of California Medical Center. Now, a patient monitoring algorithm based on machine learning had flagged one of her patients as having sepsis. And Beebe, having worked with the patient over the course of the week, was like, no, this person doesn't have sepsis. I know this, right? I can see this. But because the algorithm used a neural network, which effectively works like a black box, the algorithm couldn't explain its reasoning. It simply said the patient was septic and that standard protocols for sepsis must be followed. And the rules at the University of California Medical Center require nurses to follow protocol when a patient is flagged for sepsis. So Beebe could possibly, she could, if she wanted to, override that AI model if she got a doctor's approval, of course. But she would face disciplinary action, including termination, if she turned out to be wrong. Now, as she suspected, the algorithm was wrong. The patient didn't have sepsis. The patient didn't die. The patient really suffered no physical harm from this diagnosis, but the patient absolutely was presented with a much larger than needed bill. And more importantly, the expertise of a person who had over 15 years of her on her feet experience combined with an advanced degree was totally overridden because policy said, follow the algorithm. Now, there are also studies that show that generative AI can be really helpful and useful tool in mitigating medical staff workload. In a study published in April of last year, researchers at Johns Hopkins and the University of California, San Diego compared written responses from human physicians and those from ChatGPT to real-world questions that were asked on Reddit, the website Reddit, if you're familiar with that. And a panel of licensed healthcare professionals evaluating those responses preferred ChatGPT's answers 79% of the time. They also found that ChatGPT's answers were more empathetic and of overall higher quality than those from actual physicians. Now, some of the biases found in generative AI tools and their underlying large language models are definitely more harmful to marginalized populations than non-marginalized populations. For the last decade, researchers have found a pretty common phenomena when large language models are trained on public data sets. And that is that the model reflects the undesirable social biases in those data sets, and they often perpetuate harmful stereotypes because of the training data that's been used. For example, if you've used Outlook, Microsoft Outlook, or Gmail in the last couple of years, you've seen that these tools want to help you write your messages faster using autocomplete. Same goes for the word suggestions just above your keyboard on Android phones or iPhones, right? Right above, you can say, this is going to be your next word. Researchers at Microsoft, though, have shown that these autocomplete tools often show gendered assumptions. So in the researchers at Microsoft gave the example of, if you type, I'm not feeling great, I'm going to the doctor's office, the autocomplete response would usually include something like, let me know what he says, defaulting to he in almost all cases. Now, these models in autocomplete tools tend to be a lot older than the ones we find in ChatGPT or Claude, but they're still used by hundreds and millions of people every single day. So gender is one obvious area of bias, and race, surprise, surprise, is another. Racial bias is a systemic problem in artificial intelligence systems that attempt to, and specifically, match faces of known criminals to scans in airports or malls and city streets. The US National Institute of Standards and Technology, also known as NIST, started a project back in 2018 to benchmark the accuracy of facial recognition systems because of their sudden and rapid growth across the US, particularly in local police departments, the FBI, other federal agencies. And this found all the way back in 2019 that most of these systems, surprise, surprise, tended to be more accurate for white male faces than for people of color or for women. In particular, faces classified in NIST's database as African American or Asian were 10 to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than those classified as white. False positives were also more likely for women than for men. And these systems, it's important to remember, are frequently used by law enforcement to identify and sometimes arrest individuals for crimes they might not have committed. And racial bias finds its way into seemingly more innocuous and mundane applications of AI as well. How many of you watch shows on Netflix or on YouTube or videos on Facebook or Instagram with the captions turned on? Right? I'm of a certain age. I absolutely do this, right? I turn on captions all the time. It's sometimes really hard to hear things, right? We rely on it because it makes it easier to follow along. But a 2020 study by researchers Alison Konecki and her colleagues demonstrated there are large racial disparities in performance of automatic speech recognition from systems by Amazon, Apple, Google, IBM, Microsoft. And they focused on something called the word error rate. That's the proportion of discrepancy between the results of human transcription and machine-generated transcription on the same audio. And they showed there was an average word error rate of 0.35 for Black speakers compared with an average error word rate of 0.19 for white speakers. And this is not just about accuracy in dictating an iMessage to Siri. This is about access to voice command-driven services when you call on the phone that are increasingly common in healthcare and customer service. And racial bias is not limited to text-based generative AI like ChatGPT. It absolutely is found in visual generation AI tools like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, and probably Sora, the new video generation tool from OpenAI. A team at Bloomberg News used Stable Diffusion, which is a very powerful and popular AI image generator, to generate 5,100 images related to various job titles. And their analysis found that the images generated for every high-paying job were dominated by subjects with lighter skin tones, while subjects with darker skin tones were more commonly generated by prompts like fast food worker and social worker. And for each image depicting a perceived woman, Stable Diffusion generated almost 3 times as many images of perceived men. And most occupations in the dataset were dominated by men, except for low-paying jobs like housekeeper and cashier. And the team ultimately generated a series of average faces for each job by blending all the uniquely generated images together into one average result. And unsurprisingly, the same biases around gender and skin tone were appearing in this average face as well, as you can see here. Architect all the way down, as it were, to housekeeper. An examination of the public data sets used for training tools like ChatGPT also unsurprisingly found religious bias. In a 2021 study showed how large language models continue to associate Muslims with violence. So if you ask questions or provide prompts like 2 Muslims walked into a blank, you'd get pretty awful completions like the ones displayed on the screen here. And stereotyping and bias were also found in specific words used to describe Islam and other religions, as you can see in the bar chart in the lower right corner of the infographic. Now, you could say, okay, fine, this was done in 2021 against GPT-3. And the reality is most companies, AI companies, are working really hard to avoid this kind of bias in their public products. But this does not obviate the fact that these kinds of biases are inherent in the training models on large-scale public data sets, just like GPT-4 and Google Gemini and Claude are all trained on. And I'd like to wrap up this section on harms in generative AI by looking at the broader environmental impact of these tools. Because whether you use ChatGPT or not, these tools are starting to have a meaningful, measurable impact on the environment in which we live every day. The computational power required to train a 1.8 trillion parameter model like ChatGPT is enormous. And you add to that the hundreds of millions of people who use ChatGPT or Claude or Microsoft Copilot or Google Gemini or Midjourney every single month. Each of these questions, each of the searches, each of the prompts, and certainly each of those image generations requires additional and significant computational power. Compute is not self-sustaining, and it is currently not environmentally friendly. Alex de Vries, who's a data scientist at the Central Bank of the Netherlands, estimates that by 2027, the current major AI players will use 85.4 terawatt hours of electricity in the year 2027. That is more than what countries like Finland, Chile, Greece, Ireland, and Israel currently use in a whole year. In 2022, Xiaolai Ren, who's an associate professor of electrical and computing engineering at UC Riverside, published a paper estimating that Google's data centers alone used about 5 billion, not million, billion gallons of fresh water for cooling its computer systems using for that power tools like Google Search and Google Docs and Google Gemini. And then working from calculations of annual use for water cooling published by Microsoft itself, Xiaolai Ren concluded that one session with GPT-3, not even the most current models, which is GPT-4, one session with GPT-3 vaporizes a half liter of water. Can't get it back because of all the heat generated and needing for cooling. And AI chips are getting bigger and more power hungry. The NVIDIA conference that happened a couple weeks ago, NVIDIA is the primary global supplier for AI-oriented chips that go inside of computers. The CEO of NVIDIA is like, we need bigger, more powerful chips because we've got to do more. So they're going to get bigger and they're going to get more power hungry. And public and private and commercial demand for generative AI services is likely only to increase in the coming years as their capabilities become more powerful, right? And the power of AI chipsets will continue to come with traditional fossil fuel-based costs and their impact on the environment and the public's health. So I think we all need to ask, what is our personal impact on these fronts? How can we encourage research to be done to bring down the power and the consumption while still maintaining our desire for more capable and powerful chips and large language models? But there's always a but, right? There's always a but. These are powerful tools. They still have use and place in our daily public health and substance misuse work and research, and I hope you've seen that today. We just need to go into and engage in the process with open eyes and an understanding of the biases that may surface in what's generated for us. That's the most important thing. Keep your eyes open. Understand there's bias. Understand there's a cost. Figure out the best way to move forward for you and for your work. Okay, so that's it for the content that I wanted to cover here today. I want to know what you want to know. So you can use the Q&A pod. I think there were a couple of things that were put into the chat here, but please feel free to ask questions. Anything else you want to know with AI, anything follow-up about prompting, about the work you did today, whatever it is, happy to answer it. You got me for another about 10 minutes, or I should say 7 minutes or so, because there's a couple of housekeeping wrap-up things that we have here at the end. So let's see, different chatbots. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's important, and I appreciate the fact that companies like Claude, Anthropic as a company, Anthropic is the company that makes Claude. They are very upfront about the potential existential challenge that generative AI and sort of, I would say, actual general artificial intelligence presents to humanity currently in our capitalistic structure, what could happen there. And they're much more upfront about it. And a tool like Claude will say, hey, this might not be right, or hey, I have limitations, I might have biases. Whereas Microsoft's Copilot, ChatGPT, they really don't do that a lot. They really don't point out their own faults, which I think makes a really big and interesting difference between those tools. Let's see, Toria wants to know, where can you take free courses to understand using AI? There are some great, excellent videos. If you want to really understand about how to use AI and how AI works, there's a bunch of really good ones on YouTube. I wouldn't necessarily recommend Udemy, Udacity, those kind of like websites, because a lot of times that content is just ripped off of YouTube. You can look at on YouTube if you want to say, like, how does AI work, or how can I best use AI? Look at the results. The ones that get millions and millions of views tend to be really the best ones, because so many people are pointing to those resources, to their colleagues, to their students, to their parents, to their family members. In my experience right now, the most popular ones, videos on YouTube are really, when you ask about generative AI or using it, are really the best ones to use there. Okay, so Louise wants to know, what are some of the biggest differences between these primary AI tools? That's a great question. So the biggest differences, I would say, between the ones we use today, Microsoft Copilot, ChatGPT, and Claude, are this. Microsoft Copilot, the paid version of ChatGPT, are hooked up to the internet. So they will go out and pull out current information and add that in their creation of the response. Super helpful, super powerful. That's why I really encourage people, particularly to use Copilot. Copilot under the hood uses the exact same large language model as the paid version of ChatGPT. So you're getting that for free. There are limitations and restrictions on how many questions you can ask per hour, but you're getting the same super powerful model. And ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot, you can also upload files. ChatGPT, the paid version, offers really good, well, not really good, useful and interesting, not necessarily really good, useful and interesting data analysis tools. So you can say like, okay, take this data, let me know what you think. What is this about? Run a linear regression on it, come up with a histogram from the data in here, and it will do it. And like I said, it's not so great at visualizations, but in terms of textual analysis and coming up with the textual analysis of it, it's surprisingly good. Again, you got to validate, you got to treat it like an undergraduate who's just learning about statistics or something like that, but it can save you time, which is great. Claude, I think personally for me and my experience and the experience of my colleagues, Claude is superior when it comes to summarizing documents. Claude is great about summarizing documents. That's been my experience. I think the summaries it gives are more insightful and useful than the ones I've seen inside of ChatGPT. That's just for me. So those are some of the big differences. And then, of course, you have the image generation tools like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney, which don't do text at all, or they take text and turn that into imagery, which is something that that Copilot will do for you, although I don't think as well as Stable Diffusion or Midjourney. So hopefully that answers your question, Louise. All right, Katie says, grants haven't been AI friendly so far. Do you expect this to change? For example, they don't allow note-taking AI in meetings and trainings. Yeah, so AI is moving much faster than the law is, right? And so I was talking with Chris and with Rebecca earlier about the exact issue of note-taking. So I work at Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins is both a university and a hospital. And the number of federal regulations that the institution as a whole has to comply with are mind-boggling. I mean, it's like, state regulations, federal regulations, sometimes international cooperative agreements. And because of laws like HIPAA and because of laws like FERPA, which is a student privacy law, we are not allowed to use note-taking tools, automatic note-taking tools at all at Johns Hopkins. So if we use the Johns Hopkins, licensed Zoom instance or whatever, or even within Copilot, we can't use it, or in Teams, we can't use that for note-taking because it potentially violates HIPAA, it potentially violates FERPA. So a lot of times when these like grant-making organizations, particularly federal ones, they're like, you can't use this, or you can't use that. It's because they don't know how a generative AI might violate the laws that we all have to abide by. And that is definitely frustrating because I love some of these tools and they're really great. But I think when it comes to like grant writing, when it comes to scientific writing, be transparent. If you're going to use these tools, use them, but be transparent about how you use them. Don't ask for forgiveness. Ask up front if you're like submitting an article to a publication or you're doing it for a grant process to say, look, what is your position on AI brainstorming or using AI to help create this? I'm not going to let the AI do it for me, but I want to do some ideation, some brainstorming, some refinement with this. Is that okay under your rules? Because you don't want to get found out later on and they're like, ooh, you used AI, you're out, right? It's not the route you want to go down there. Hopefully that answers your question, Katie. And then finally, last one, in a perfect world, how can we interact with AI in a way that helps us to be more efficient as practitioners, but not to the point of harm? Is there a healthy balance? Yeah, I think there is. I've only been doing this really in terms of like generative AI, like the rest of you, since the fall of 2022 when ChatGPT burst onto the scene. I think it's ultimately about being skeptical, going in with eyes wide open and saying, okay, this is cool, but let me check this. Are there signs of bias for this? I don't trust you as much as I would say, a peer-reviewed journal article. And even then, sometimes you can't trust it because the research may not be reproducible. But to go in with eyes open and say, I know you could mess something up. I know you could have a bias here. I'm going to use you, but I'm also going to hold you to accountability, whatever output you generate, and make sure with my best effort that you're not reflecting those biases based on what I can see and the output that comes in there. I think that's really the best way to use it, because these tools can save you time. They can save you money. They can do work in seconds that would take you hours to do yourself. And I think that's enormously powerful. But a healthy dose of skepticism and saying, do I see bias? Do I see errors? Makes a big difference in terms of your ability to turn that output into a useful and usable product. Hopefully that answers your question. And I think we're pretty much at time, right, Rebecca? Right, Chris?
Yes, if you want me to go ahead and wrap things up, I'm happy to do that at this point. And I'll go ahead and share my screen that I do have a few things to share with you all, including Brian. We are bringing Brian back to talk about a different topic. So hang in here and I'm going to share when that's going to be. But first of all, huge thank you to you, Brian, for this incredible webinar packed with so much information. And I have to say, I personally have tried to use AI before very unsuccessfully, because I now know why. Other people are
Oh,
like, oh, it's
good.
so great, it's so great. But like every time I tried, I wasn't getting anything out of it. It was because my prompts were not written well. So
It makes a
as you
difference.
were having everybody do the activities, I did them too. I was like, oh, I'm actually getting something valuable out of this. So thank you so much for not only providing the understanding of what AI is all about and how how it works, but also how to actually use it well. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, a few things coming up I want to make sure everybody knows about. We have coming up on April 25th, strategies for preventing substance misuse in older adults. We have our last two sessions of the deep dive into prevention ethics coming up on the first Thursdays in May and June. Working within rural communities. If you do any work as a prevention professional in rural communities, highly recommend that you join us on May 16th. Project management skills. This is a 3-hour training for substance misuse prevention practitioners. So if that is an area that you're interested in learning more about, hope you can join us then. We have Jason Kilmer coming back on June 4th on preventing youth cannabis use. If you've seen him before, you know he's a fantastic presenter and always provides a lot of great information. So be sure to join us then. On June 20th, Media Literacy 101 for substance misuse prevention practitioners. And here it is. Brian is coming back on June 27th to talk about using storytelling techniques to create highly engaging and impactful presentations. I told Brian that I've worked in the field I've been doing trainings for 30 plus years. And I saw a recording that he did, a recording of training he did for Michigan. And on this topic, and he completely changed how I look at creating my training. So even if you've been doing this for a long time, I highly recommend, if you do any kind of presentations, either in your local community, to your community coalitions, if you do it on regional level, state level, etc., this information will be useful for you. So be sure to sign up for that. All right, a couple more things. We recently created this document to help summarize the substance misuse prevention courses that are the free self-paced online courses on healthy knowledge. So be sure to download that if you would like an easy guide to finding the courses you'd like to take on healthy knowledge. If you haven't already, be sure to like and or follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. This is the way we get information out to you on a daily basis. So we do our weekly email every Friday, but this is something that we can put up right away every day, information for substance misuse prevention practitioners. So be sure to join us there if you use those social media platforms. And as Rebecca mentioned at the beginning, please do take time to complete the evaluation form that you will be redirected to at the end of this webinar once we close it out. I read every single comment that's written in there, so please know it's not going into a black hole. It actually is used, and we take that information and apply it to our future events. So please take time to do that. And with that, any last comments, Brian or Rebecca?
Thank you. Again, thank you for having me here. This is awesome. And a great group of people, really. Great questions. Really enjoyed it. And I'm so glad that so many of you got value out of this today.
Right. Thank you again, Brian. Rebecca, any last thoughts?
No, I think we're good.
All right. Well, I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your Thursday. Take care and hope you'll join us for another event soon. Bye-bye.